Haunted Hospital Wing by Scary Hours. The first time Grace heard about the East Wing, it was in whispers from the other nurses. They called it the Dead Wing, as if it were a joke, but there was always an uneasiness in their voices when they mentioned it. St. Mary's Hospital was an old building, one that had survived countless renovations and upgrades over the years. But the East Wing had always remained untouched. It was sealed off, a forgotten part of the hospital's history that no one seemed to talk about openly. The reasons for its closure had become part of hospital lore. Nurses swapped stories in the break room about why it had been shut down: fires, ghost sightings, tragic accidents. The official explanation was vague structural issues, a lack of demand for additional rooms, or the typical bureaucratic nonsense. Yet, one thing was clear: no one worked there, and no patients were ever placed there. That is, until Grace's night shift assignment changed. She had been a nurse at St. Mary's for only 2 months, the kind of new hire who was still trying to prove herself. It was no surprise when the head nurse asked her to take an overnight shift in the East Wing after a bed shortage in the other wards. Just a couple of patients, the head nurse had said. "We need the space tonight, but don't worry, it's just for one shift." Grace nodded, ignoring the pit that settled in her stomach. She'd heard the rumors, but she wasn't superstitious. A part of her felt excited to be working in a part of the hospital that most avoided. Perhaps it would give her some quiet time. But as she made her way down the long hallway to the East Wing that first night, her steps felt heavier with each passing second. The hospital lights dimmed in the corridors, flickering slightly, as if unsure whether to stay on or give way to the darkness. The door to the East Wing was old and creaked when she pushed it open, revealing a corridor that was dimly lit and covered in the sterile white tiles common to hospitals. But the air was different here: stale, musty, like a room that hadn't been aired out in years. She adjusted her scrubs, squared her shoulders, and walked in. The first night, the East Wing was quieter than the rest of the hospital. Too quiet. Grace only had 2 patients under her care: an elderly man, Mr. Jacobs, recovering from surgery, and a young woman, Emily, who had been brought in after a car accident. Both were stable and should have been easy to monitor throughout the night. Grace's job was simple: check on them periodically, administer any necessary medication, and ensure they rested peacefully. The first hour passed uneventfully. Grace settled in at the nurse's station, filling out reports and occasionally glancing at the monitors. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease crept into her bones. The silence was unnatural. The hospital was never this quiet, even at night. There was always the hum of machines, the distant chatter of other nurses, the occasional beeping of monitors. But here, in the East Wing, there was nothing. Just stillness. Until the voices began. It started with a faint whisper, so soft Grace almost didn't catch it. She paused, looking up from her paperwork, straining to hear. Nothing. She shook her head and returned to her work, brushing it off as her imagination. But then she heard it again, clearer this time, a voice calling her name. Grace. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood up quickly, peering down the hall. The lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows along the walls, but the corridor was empty. No one was there. She checked on her patients, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the deserted wing. Mr. Jacobs was asleep, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Emily lay in her bed, her eyes closed, seemingly resting. Everything seemed normal, but that feeling of being watched lingered. When she returned to the nurse's station, the whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread remained. The second night, Grace almost called in sick the next night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to go back. Maybe it was her pride. She didn't want to seem weak, spooked by ghost stories. She had worked in hospitals for years and had seen her share of strange, tragic things. The rumors about the East Wing were just rumors. But when she returned for her shift, that oppressive atmosphere greeted her once again. The stale air, the flickering lights, the silence that seemed to swallow up all sound. And then there was the cold. The temperature in the East Wing was at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the hospital. Grace checked the thermostat normal, but no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the chill that seeped into her bones. She wrapped herself in her jacket and tried to ignore the feeling of eyes watching her from the shadows. This time, the whispers started earlier, and they weren't just calling her name. Help us, the voices said. Please don't leave us. Grace's skin crawled. She forced herself to check on her patients again, praying she wouldn't see anything unusual. Mr. Jacobs was fine. Emily, however, was wide awake, staring at the ceiling with wide, frightened eyes. Are you all right? Emily, Grace asked softly. Standing by her bedside, Emily's lips trembled, her eyes darting toward the door. I hear them, she whispered. The voices. They keep calling my name. Grace felt her heart rate quicken. It's probably just the medication, she said, though she didn't believe her own words. You should try to rest. Emily shook her head violently. No, they're real. They're here. Grace's stomach twisted. She forced a smile and left Emily's room, but the voices followed her, growing louder as she walked back to the station. That night, Grace barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw figures standing in the corners of her vision, shadows that disappeared when she turned to look. And in the distance, she heard the faint sound of crying. The discovery. On the third night, Grace couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. During her break, she approached Carol, one of the senior nurses, in the break room. Carol had been working at St. Mary's for over 20 years. If anyone knew about the East Wing, it would be her. Why was the East Wing shut down? Grace asked, trying to sound casual. Carol's expression darkened. "You're working in the East Wing?" she asked, her voice lowering to a near whisper. Grace nodded, and Carol leaned in closer. "That wing was closed down about 15 years ago after an incident," Carol said quietly. "There was a fire, small, but enough to cause panic. Several patients were trapped, and a few didn't make it. They say their spirits never left. There were sightings, strange occurrences, people hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. It became so bad that the hospital decided to close it off for good." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "And they just left it?" Carol shrugged. "What else could they do? There are things in this world we can't explain, Grace. Some things are better left undisturbed." The final night. By the fourth night, Grace was on edge. The voices were louder, more insistent. The air in the East Wing felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped even further. It felt like winter had settled into the halls. Emily was the worst off. She hadn't slept in days, her eyes sunken and wide with fear. She kept muttering about figures standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. Grace had tried to reassure her, but nothing helped. As the clock struck midnight, the power in the East Wing suddenly went out. The hallway plunged into darkness, and Grace felt her stomach drop. She grabbed a flashlight from the nurse's station and made her way to check on her patients. The beam of light flickered as she walked, casting eerie shadows along the walls. When she reached Emily's room, she found the bed empty. Panic surged through her as she rushed through the halls, calling Emily's name. The voices, however, were louder now, more distinct. They were no longer just whispers, they were screams. "Help us," they cried. "Don't leave us." Grace ran to the source of the voices, her heart pounding in her chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, she saw them, the spirits of the patients who had died in the fire. They stood in the hallway, their faces twisted in agony, reaching out to her with pleading hands. But as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving only the echo of their cries. Grace found Emily in the old operating room, standing in the center, her eyes wide with terror. The spirits surrounded her, their whispers filling the air. "They won't leave me alone," Emily sobbed. "They want to take Emmy." Grace grabbed her, pulling her out of the room, and they ran down the hallway, the cries of the spirits echoing behind them. The air grew colder, the lights flickered, and Grace could feel their presence closing in. When they finally burst through the doors of the East Wing and into the main hospital, the oppressive weight lifted. The air was warm again, and the voices stopped. The aftermath. Grace never returned to the East Wing. The hospital claimed that the power outage had been a fluke, a minor electrical issue, but Grace knew better. The spirits of the patients who had died in the fire still haunted those halls, trapped in their endless suffering. Unable to move on. She transferred to another hospital shortly after, but the memories of that night never left her. Every now and then, in the stillness of the night, she could still hear their voices whispering, calling her name, and she knew, deep down, that the East Wing was not empty.